A topic within programming that tends to, between coaches, have fairly strong opinions one way or the other is deloads. And some are fairly strongly against it, almost stating that you're just wasting a week of training. If you have 52 weeks in a year, why waste X amount of weeks deloading when you could be training? And then on the opposite end, including me, there are people very pro deloads and utilize them in a very structured manner. Some being more reactive, myself being more structured of having planned deload weeks with possibilities of being reactive and needing the deload when needed. But using deloads is very much a tool within training, not as a punishment, not as a way to reduce progression or stop progression, like some coaches I think will kind of react towards them as a way of not training, so you're not going to progress, as well as I think they help my lifters progress even more. So they are very much a tool we use, and I'm going to go through the 6 reasons of why, with some of them being more of the reasons most people understand with the deloads of kind of what they do physiologically, but other ones being a bit more mental and understanding that almost, I would say, maybe the bigger benefit of deloading is actually mental breaks for a lifter that almost helps more in the long term than the physiological effects. So looking at the reasons why for a deload week, the first one, and probably the main one most people come to, is managing fatigue and dissipating fatigue. We train for a certain period of time. We get to a point where fatigue starts to overreach a little bit, so we deload intensity and volume to kind of be able to dissipate that and reset for the next training block. And I look at that as very much a reason to deload. I think there's a lot more to deloading than just that, but very much so when we get into a new training block, I want to have 0 variables. I don't want to have fatigue variables that are carrying over from prior training blocks, then masking what is occurring in this next training block and not knowing if it's working, because something in the prior training block is still kind of masking our ability to potentiate strength and show adaptations in this next training block. So deloading helps us to be able to manage that fatigue to get us back to a certain baseline that's going to allow us to be able to go into that next training block in a fresh state. The next reason that's pretty common that most people hear about is kind of a resensitization to training, or a resensitization, I can never say that word, to the stimulus presenting, meaning that we start to adapt to a stimulus. We don't and we don't continue to progress from it, which is very true. But I think maybe something that is maybe used a bit is using a deload to resensitize the volume and intensity. And I don't think 1 week is really going to do that. I think if someone is used to higher volume or higher intensity and we're trying to resensitize them to that, we're probably going to need a prolonged period of weeks, if not months, of lower volume and lower intensity for their body to kind of reacclimate to lower and to find a new baseline at that lower set point. The resensitization of a deload is less about resensitizing the volume and intensity, and more that we've produced the stimulus and adaptation we can from a training block. We cease to continue to progress from it. So we're gonna manage fatigue. We're gonna dissipate it so that we can restart a new block with a new set of stimulus and tools to be able to create progress in a fresh state. When it comes to those first 2 points of managing fatigue and resensitizing, I think a lot of times when people are doing that, they're thinking more of like the muscles and the nervous system. And honestly, the muscles require fairly fast. I don't really think we ever need to deload necessarily to allow our, in a sense, muscles to recover. I think the sense of thinking we're overreaching our nervous system tends to get overplayed a little bit. I think about 3-4 years ago, that was a big thing that we're like literally just running our nervous system in the ground. So we have to deload for that. And at least with me, I don't think I've ever had a lifter start showing signs of truly nervous system fatigue, because there's actually some pretty serious symptoms that go along with that, leading to the possibility of something like rhabdomyolysis. I've never had a lifter show any of those. I don't think we've ever gotten to the point where we truly run their nervous system in the ground to the point where they're needing a deload to in a sense, survive and not go into these actual health concerns. What I think more is actually happening is, one, we are dissipating some fatigue. If we're going up to like a maximum recoverable volume, we're trying to bring our ability, our fatigue back down to ramp back up to that. But more so, what probably needs recovery that doesn't recover near as well as our muscles and our nervous system is our tendons and ligaments. Something like a quad tendon. If someone's having continual issues with quad tendinopathy, we probably aren't going to see that dissipate and start to heal very well unless we do some type of change to volume and workload. And that's pretty much injury management in a nutshell. I can make an entire video detailing that of exactly what we need to do when it comes to load management to help with pain and flare-ups of injury or tendonitis in particular, where we get in our elbows, our knees, anywhere it might be. We need to adjust workload. And And while a deload can be used almost kind of reactively if those things kind of spur up, I use them more proactively. If we know at a certain point we're starting kind of reaching that tipping point of fatigue, and if we go past that, we're going to start to kind of start to accumulate some possible workload related issues. We're going to be having deloads scheduled regularly that we know at that point, okay, that's where we're going to kind of push to that point where we're starting to get fairly fatigued, and then we're going to deload to bring that back down so we can be proactive to kind of stay away from those issues of workload related pain and flare-ups. With all that said though, the physiological benefits of deloads, I honestly think the single biggest benefit I have with my lifters is the mental break that deloads provide. It's very common when I first start coaching someone and they aren't used to deloading that they hate it. They absolutely hate deloads. They get into the week and all they want to do is train, and they don't like having the deload. And I actually don't mind that. For those who have been powerlifting for a while, eventually the point of that, most powerlifters get to a point where they don't just, it's not always fun. There's some sessions we don't want to do. There's periods of time where we're burnt out. That happens in the longevity of the sport, in that we do 3 movements. We squat, we bench, and we deadlift. It tends to get boring over times. And a lot of times lifters have this kind of like honeymoon period where they always enjoy training, and that eventually goes away. And so it is good to have breaks from training mentally. And even if you don't want a break from training, I see a big benefit in missing training that week. And missing training in the sense of like, I really want to train again, because what we see is this constant cycle of breaks mentally on a scheduled basis, the ability to miss training and to be excited and motivated and focused to come back into a new training block. There is a very high correlation into a lifter's progress and success when it comes to fun, enjoyment, and motivation. Those are big keys to success, and those regular scheduled deloads can help to keep those variables more consistent. Versus seeing these long periods of time where we're burnt out and motivation's low, we can have these more regularly scheduled breaks to allow this mental break from training, this monotony of training, of heavy training, and be able to allow that lifter to kind of have a week to be able to start to relax a little bit. Maybe not have to be as mentally focused in kind of a good way, because sometimes that's just stressful and anxiety's high that we always have to be so focused on the lift. To be able to kind of have this mental refresher to come back to training the next week and be able to put more into it. And that's where I see probably the biggest benefit. And I've seen time and time again, I've had multiple lifters where we've deloaded, and then we've tried maybe a wave loading approach. And within about 5 or 6 months, they come back to me and they say, can we go back to deloading? And I ask why. And it has nothing to do with kind of the training or the training progress. They're like, I just need a break. Like he's like, I realized that even though I didn't like deloads in the past, I now realize I really needed them because it just allowed me a week to kind of relax and have a mental break. And so that's what I see is in the short term, if you've got one more powerlifting meet that you're ever going to do in your entire life and you need to put everything into those 6 months, maybe you don't deload. Maybe we need to maximize in a wave loading approach to increase the amount of productive training weeks we're doing in that 6-month period. But if you're looking at most powerlifters who want to be successful, there's a long lifespan to be truly successful and competitive as a powerlifter, 5 to 10 years. And so if we're looking at that span, we're gonna be able to produce more consistent and efficient and productive training by having regular scheduled deloads to prevent burnout, to miss training, to create excitement in training, as well as the next point I'm gonna get to, which is to allow a life to happen. So what I mean by allowing life to occur is that we are humans. We have jobs, we have families, we have final exams, we have vacations, we have things that come up. Within the sense of deloading, reactive deloads are very great for that. Being able to plan out a deload that is able to line up with a vacation or an exam week. If you're in a college kid and you know you need to study and you need to be able to prioritize other things than training. If we never deload and we never allow that option, it makes training very hard to fit in with life, which then eventually is for sure going to lead to training burnout. It's just going to happen because it creates this thing that our hobby, which 99% of the people watching this video, this is a hobby, not a profession. There's very few people that are going to make this profession, and there's very few people who are ever going to be competitive enough to even make this profession in the sense of being an elite athlete like Russ Orhue, who can literally like live to train and makes his living off of training and his business off of training. Most of us do this as a hobby, and so it's not priority number 1, it's priority number 2, 3, or 4 below job, family, religion, anything like that. So we need to make sure it meshes in well with that. And so deloads can really help to allow life to happen. And so in the sense of argument of being reactive versus structured, because I do structured deloads and reactive if needed, some people say, well, we don't need to ever structure a deload. We'll just be reactive when these things come up. And my argument is to that is, yes, if things are coming up, we need to be reactive and plan for it, or we can just be proactive and allow the athlete to be able to kind of know when they can plan for things. So if an athlete knows that they always have a 5-week training block with 4 weeks training and 1 week deloading, they can pretty much know when a deload's coming up. They can be able to plan for things. They can plan more doctor's appointments, knowing that they probably have more time from decreased training sessions. They can maybe know that they're going to take a little mini trip and say, hey, Steve, can I do 3 sessions this week and combine 2 sessions versus 4? Because I was going to go out of town Friday through Sunday, and I know it's a deload week, so would it be any issue if we can combine those? It allows them to plan ahead. And that just makes life easier. It makes life easier and less stressful of knowing that I'm going to have these weeks coming up that I know I can probably plan things for, because I'm going to have more time and my training's going to be, I don't want to say not serious. We don't need to treat deload like it's a week off. It's still a serious week to take training seriously. But at the same time, it does the anxiety and stress of having to go in and lift really heavy weights and be very focused to be able to lift those weights in the best way possible, that decreases a bit. So we can take it with a bit more of a relaxed approach, and that allows people to have these mental breaks and be able to schedule life around training, which all leads back to longevity in training, of productive training over a long period of time, and decreasing mental burnout. And the last thing, hopefully it doesn't happen, but injuries happen, and that's where we can be reactive with deloads, and then we need to be able to put a deloaded week in because we have some type of pain flare-up or injury occur. And while that is always an option, I program regularly structured deloads to try and be proactive to prevent that from ever being needed to happen. If we can use deloads to help kind of manage fatigue a bit better, knowing that we get to a certain point each training block where we're going to start to kind of tip over that point of what we can recover from. If we just plan deloads at that point, we can tend to have longer periods of productive training without having injury. Now, powerlifting is a sport where injuries do occur, so that is going to happen eventually, but I just find that I can keep my athletes healthier by having these structured deload periods to be able to have a bit easier time managing fatigue, especially in the fact that I don't have anyone who trains to be a powerlifter professionally. There's life happening, so there's these fluctuations with how they're able to recover. So to be able to have those regularly scheduled deloads helps to make sure that we don't push past those during times of higher stress or higher workload or higher personal life things going on. So we've covered why to deload, with the 6 reasons I kind of feel like deloads are needed within the structured way I program them. But also a big question then is when do I program these deloads if it's going to be in a structured manner, not reactive? And a lot of that goes back to some of the things I talked about in my programming part 1 and programming part 2 in the series of volume and intensity, and I'll link those in the comments below. And that was in the sense of time to peak. Very similar to kind of how Mike Teixeira does within the emerging strategies approach that was kind of adopted from Bondarchuk, is we tend to have a certain amount of times of exposure or certain weeks of training that we tend to peak our performance. And what we typically see, and I typically see with my lifters, is we get to a certain point where strength continues to increase, the stimulus creates adaptations that produces progress, and then they in a sense peak at a certain point. And then if we go one more week, they don't necessarily see this drop off, which is what I think most people think is going to happen if they in sense kind of go too far in their training or overreach per se. It's more we kind of see this progression and then a little bit of a plateau. Like we just get into the next week, let's say week 4 they peak, and then we go to week 5. In week 5, what we see is more just kind of a plateau. They don't really like get stronger per se. We see the same similar level of performance. And then towards probably the end of week 5, we maybe see a little regression. And then if we go to a week 6, we definitely then start seeing some regression. So I plan these deloads to be after that peak, because we know that coming to week 5 and 6, if we're going to see plateau and regression, we're no longer adapting and progressing with the stimulus of this training block. So we're going to then deload instead to be able to dissipate that fatigue. And then go into a new training block with a new stimulus to adapt to and I keep using the word fresh state, just meaning in a recovered state to where we don't have this variable of fatigue masking our strength going into the next training block. Typically within my system, and I always like to say my system because every coach is a little bit different, and even if they're similar in some manner, their system may produce different results in kind of what is the time to peak and when deload should be structured. But I typically find most of my athletes are going to have somewhere between 4 to 7 week training blocks. So if it's 4 weeks, meaning 3 weeks training, 1 week deload. So peaking sometime between 3 weeks and 6 weeks, with most people being in between. I would say the majority of people I coach are 5 week training blocks or 6 week training blocks, with those 4 weeks being a training and then the 5th week being a deload. And we kind of find that structure by being open-ended at first. And so while eventually I like to be more structured with the deload process, when I first get a new lifter, I might write 4 weeks of training with a 5th week deload, but it's going to be very open-ended. We're going to keep going until we kind of see that plateau and regression. So maybe we go 4 weeks and then we go into the 5th week and we see another continued spike in training. Like we see more progress, but then we go into a 6th week and we see a plateau and a slight regression. Okay, noted. 5th week, this lifter peaked on the first block we ever did together. That still doesn't mean that's their time to peak. That's only one training block, and every training block could be a little bit different with kind of the stress we're inducing and when they're going to kind of reach that performance peak. So we're going to do another training block, and maybe this training block, they actually get to a 6th week and they progress, and that was awesome. And then we get to a 7th week. We're still open-ended. We added a 7th week to that training, but then we see a plateau and regression. Okay, noted. First block they peak on week 5. Second block they peak on week 6. Then we get into a third training block. This block they peak on week 5, regress week 6. Again, noted. Peak on week 5. And the more data we accumulate and the longer I coach someone, the more we can say, okay, 80 to 90% of the time they're peaking on week 5. So we're probably just going to make that their standard block length. And then just if a block is going really, really well and we don't have a timeline, we can be able to be reactive and maybe add a week to it. But what really helps to be able to have that kind of time to peak and that knowledge of here's long a training block should be is we start to have really consistent training in the sense of like being able to get the correct training stimulus, to be able to peak when we want, get the adaptations we want, and then deload when we need to, so we're not pushing past the recovery abilities. And one of the big benefits of knowing this time to peak and their average training block length is using that to be able to set up and sense their meet prep and how they peak into a meet. So if we know an athlete tends to peak on week 4, and so we do a 5th week deload, we're going to try and set up so that leading into the meet, we are running training blocks that fit into that schedule for multiple reasons. And we'll really try and line that up. Let's say the final 3 blocks is really what we call kind of meet prep, and they're doing a 15-week meet prep, but we're 18 weeks out. I may very well do kind of like a little 3-week mini block just to kind of just hold us over till we get to those 15 weeks so we can line up their training to be within that 5-week window each block, to one, not only make training the most productive and consistent because we know they tend to peak on week 4 and we'll deload week 5, but also as we're peaking and tapering for a meet in that final training block, we know kind of how they respond in the sense of peaking on week 4, and then week 5 they start to kind of hit that if we were to keep going, at the beginning of week 5 they're kind of at that point where they're kind of plateaued. Well, then we know how we can slightly start tapering that week to get us back to peak performance in just a 1-week span. If our training blocks are kind of a variable length and they're kind of all over the place, it's going to be a bit harder to kind of know exactly how to get them from that last week of training to taper into that Saturday per se. But if we always run 5 weeks and we know week 4 they peak, week 5 we need to deload, well, the deload now just turns into a taper and it leads into the meet, and it makes it much easier to be able to peak a lifter on meet day because we already have this consistent data set of exactly how they respond to training block to block, when they're the strongest, and how we can be able to kind of taper and deload off of that. Like I kind of alluded to though, if a block is going great, especially if we don't have a timeline of a meet coming up, let's keep it rolling. Maybe we know this lifter always tends to peak week 4, but we're in the middle of an off season and for some reason training's going different. Honestly, I saw this a lot this year with the situation. I mean, a lot of people weren't working as much. And so we saw different life stressors, like maybe they were able to sleep and rest more. They had manual labor jobs that they were no longer working for a period of time. We started to see different training data and different adaptations and how they respond to training different. And if we didn't have a meet coming up, if they normally peak week 4, but they're doing really good and we're not having many fatigue markers saying that they need to deload, well, we'll be reactive and we'll start to add weeks after that and always be able to be open-ended and reactive. I think that's where a lot of people start to kind of hate on or not understand the idea of structured deloads is they are structured, but they are still reactive at the same time. Unless we are in a timeline of a meet prep per se, and like we have a deadline of when we need to actually peak for a meet, we can always be very reactive with that deload and be able to adjust as needed, whether we need to shorten a training block because maybe life stress is really high and they're actually not recovering very well, or they're recovering super well and we actually allow them to be able to increase that stimulus if it's going to keep producing adaptations and progress. So if you usually watch my videos, you know I always like to go deep into the why so you have a really good understanding of the reasoning behind everything. I obviously went through the when as well so we can understand when we need to deload, because the when is a very important part of making it actually a productive and efficient tool that helps with improving our training. So with that said, let's now get into the how. So I'm going to kind of break down the general structure and template of deloads, and understand that everything's kind of a range. Every lifter's different, so I give more of ranges of kind of be within, and then I'm going to and from there I'm going to show you an example of one of my lifters' deloads, and then actually go through and program it while I'm doing a screen recording, so you can see me going through and exactly how I'm going to program that. And then afterwards we'll finish off with kind of the caveats here of understanding if there is a range and there's different lifters, how do we understand how we adjust that based off of individual response. So let's get into it. So here we've got our deload, set, rep, and intensity structure. So within the way I deload, we have a volume drop and an intensity drop. With some people with how they deload, maybe they just do a volume drop and they keep intensity up. I'm not a huge fan of that, just for the reason that I don't think tendons and ligaments do very well with not dropping intensity, and that's just from experience. That's not from any scientific data or anything. I've just found that when people tendons and ligaments don't tend to respond well if we're not dropping intensity a little bit along with volume. And then some people, they actually keep they drop intensity, but then they keep volume the same. I think that could possibly work. That's basically more of like a wave loading approach. So when I'm talking in a deload manner, I'm talking some type of structure of a volume and an intensity drop. So as we're going through this, I have set up here kind of the different categories of exercise. So we have squat, bench press, and deadlift. So the competition movements and their variants, such like a pause squat or something like that. Compound pressing accessory, something like a dumbbell bench press. Isolation pec or shoulder accessory, something like a cable fly or a side lateral. Compound quad accessory, something that might be more like a belt squat, a reverse lunge, a leg press. A compound hinge accessory, something like a dumbbell RDL or a hyperextension. Isolation quad or hamstring accessory movement, so something like a leg extension or a hamstring curl. Pull accessory, so any rowing or pull down movements. Upper back accessory like rear flies or face pulls. Tricep accessory like a tricep extension. Bicep accessory like bicep curls. And then lastly, just because I'm a big fan of blood flow restriction training and I like including it, I included blood flow restriction of kind of how we're going to go through this. So within this, I have set, repetition, and intensity and kind of how we're going to fluctuate that, because all three of these are variables that we can manipulate based on each individual exercise here. So with squat, I have here that I'm going to drop one set per workout. So what that means, well, let's say the lifter is squatting twice a week, and they squat 5 sets on day 1 and 5 sets on day 2. That means on day 1 I'm going to have them squat 4 total sets, and on day 2 I'm going to have them squat 4 total sets. So 1 set drop per workout. For bench press, we're not going to drop any sets, because I'll get around to this. I mean, obviously, each lift is independent of each other, and bench press tends to not need to be deloaded as much. Dropping sets and dropping repetitions both affect volume. So we can do one or the other, or both, to either increase or decrease how much volume we're dropping. So with bench press, if we have 5 sets on one day, I'm not going to drop any of those. On deadlift, we're going to drop 1 set per workout, just like squat. And then really going down all of these movements, we're going to drop 1 set per exercise. So if they were doing 3 sets of 10 on dumbbell bench press, they're going to do 2 sets of 10. The only one I don't drop on with the accessories is blood flow restriction, and that's just because if you've ever done blood flow restriction, I typically do it in a 4-set manner. If you drop a set, you really don't get much benefit from it. So you kind of have to keep the sets and the reps the same, and I'll kind of describe that a little more in a second. So like I said, sets and repetition can both affect volume. So for squat, we're also going to drop 1 rep per set. So if they were doing 5 sets of 5, I would now have them do 4 sets of 4. So 1 set dropped and 1 rep dropped. For bench press, if they're doing 5 sets of 5, we're not dropping a set, we're just dropping a rep. So they're going to 5 sets of 4, which is a little bit less of a volume drop. And then for deadlift, per most people, deadlift just tends to fatigue the highest, especially conventional deadlifters deadlifters tend to carry a lot of fatigue from deadlifting, and that could be a whole video of kind of why that is. And I mean, arguably, one of the biggest reason is usually just lifting the most weight on deadlift, so there's going to be the most systematic fatigue carried over from it. So there, we could drop anywhere between 1 to 2 reps per set. So we might go, instead of 4 sets of 4, just dropping 1 rep, we might go 4 sets of 3, just dependent on each lifter and kind of the extent they need to deload. For all of the accessories, mainly because they're just not going to be as fatiguing. I mean, that's the reason why we use accessory movements, to be able to allow those to be added for the hypertrophy benefits and to fill in volume gaps without creating as much fatigue as a squat, bench press, or deadlift. For those, we're not going to drop any reps. So if we were doing 3 sets of 10 on dumbbell bench press, we're going to drop 1 set, but we're going to keep the reps the same and do 2 sets of 10 so that we still have the adequate repetitions there and we don't do too much of a volume drop. And that goes all the way down for all the exercises. Then we get into intensity. So that's how we kind of compound things. So with squat, I'll tend to do anywhere between a 7.5 to 12.5% drop from the prior week. So we have to have an understanding. If week 4 was our peak week, and that was also, I mean, that should be our heaviest week, we are doing about a 7.5 to 12.5% drop from that. I can tell you with some of my lifters, especially on bench press, their deload week is actually almost heavier than their week 1 sometimes. But we are doing a rep drop, if we're doing a 1 rep drop or a set drop, we're still decreasing total volume, but we also might be, by dropping a rep on top of intensity, we're also decreasing relative intensity because that weight is now relative to 1 rep less per set. So somewhere between 7.5 to 12.5 based on the lifter's need, which we'll cover in a little bit. Bench press, not nearly as fatiguing, probably only 5 to 10%. There's some people I barely deload their bench press because if we do deload it too much, they detrain very easy. So I usually do a much lower deload on the intensity drop when it comes to bench press. And as I already mentioned, deadlift tends to fatigue the highest. So again, dependent on the lifter, somewhere probably between 10 to 15% intensity drop. And then as we're going through accessory movements are all the same. A dumbbell bench press is not the same as a cable fly. So on a dumbbell bench press, I'm probably going to do about a 5 to 10% intensity drop, which is usually going to be maybe 5 to 10 pounds. If they're using 80-pound dumbbells, they might be going down to 75-pound dumbbells this week. For an isolation pec or shoulder accessory, I put here more of like 3% to a 1 RPE. So if it was programmed at an 8 RPE, now I'm programming it at a 7 RPE. A compound quad or a hinge accessory, very much like a squat or a deadlift, it tends to be more fatiguing than a pressing movement. So I usually have these deload a bit more with the accessory movements, such as like a belt squat or a lunge, somewhere between 7.5 to 15%, dependent on the lifter, and maybe the intensity that weight was even programmed at in the first place. For a isolation quad or hammer string accessory, I'm going to go 1 RPE. For a pull accessory, 1 RPE, which I keep saying 1 RPE because 1 RPE equates to about 3%. So I'm more just, most of these I'm just dropping 1 RPE than versus saying drop 3% because it's much easier for a lifter to be able to kind of conceptualize dropping 1 RPE. Tricep accessory, somewhere around 1 to 2 RPE, depending on the intensity I had it at. And then blood flow restriction, like I said, if they were doing 4 sets of 12 on blood flow restriction, I'm just going to keep that volume the same. We're just going to do an intensity drop because for those who aren't familiar with blood flow restriction, you're using like maybe 30 to 40% of the weight you normally use. Like it's fairly low impact. So we're just going to make it a little bit easier by dropping a couple RPEs. So we're not going to complete failure by that 4th set. So that's the general structure I'm looking at of where my framework for the set, repetition, and intensity drop I have within the deload week. And how that kind of plays out is looking here, I have the total volume reduction kind of calculated here. So here we can see kind of the intensity drop. Dependent on each lift, it's going to be somewhere between 5 to 15% for the average intensity drop on the week. For volume, for squat, what's going to happen is what's going to play out to around 50 to 60% volume of the previous week. So about a 40 to 50% drop. For bench press, about 70 to 80% of the volume of the previous week. And for deadlift, about 45 to 55%. And so the example I'm actually going to show you, this is actually their total volume from week 5, about 27,000 on squat, about 23,000 on bench press, and about 17,500 on deadlift. This was their deload week. So I think this is about a 58%. This is about 58%. Well, actually, let's calculate real quick and I'll show you. About 58%. Bench was about 75% of the prior week's volume, and deadlift about 48% of the prior week's volume. So again, a general framework for the extent we're going to deload when it comes to the volume reduction during a deload week to be able to dissipate fatigue and be able to go into the next training block and recovered. All right, so taking that conceptual framework, let's kind of look at an example now. So this is my lifter Patrick, and the one I just showed when it came to the volume reduction. We have our week 5, and then going into our deload week. So just looking at these numbers right off the bat, it's kind of hard to really be able to understand kind of what's going on, but this just kind of gives you an idea of kind of what it looks like. So we can see here, again, we obviously see the weight dropping. We see 90% of last week, so a 10% drop from dumbbell bench press. We see an RPE drop on seated cable row, and then BFR tricep extension choice, we see a 2 RPE drop. So that's an example, but now let's actually take Patrick's week 5, and I have a completely empty slate here, and let me just go through and show you exactly how I'm going to program this deload week, because that'll make a lot more sense. So for Patrick, we do a 10% reduction in intensity on squat. So I'm going to go equals M round of the 613 times 0.9, which is a 10% reduction, rounding to the nearest 5. You can see here the formula there. M round, so it rounds to the nearest 5, 10% reduction. So that's bringing us to 550. And really, all I got to do there is just copy and paste that to every squat workout. Now, could I get super detailed and go into every single one of these workouts and figure out a different percentage drop? Possibly, but I think that's just getting way too many variables to really know if anything's happening. I'd rather just keep those consistent each day and adjust as needed, because that's going to help us to be able to limit variables that we're changing within the week. So next up, we had bench press. Patrick needs a very slight deload on bench press. He doesn't do much. So we're going to go M round of the previous week times 0.95, so it's a 5% drop, and plug that in and copy and paste it throughout his 3 bench press days. So we've got everything kind of formulating there to give us that 5% drop. And lastly, here we've got deadlift. Patrick is a conventional deadlifter. He tends to have very high fatigue on deadlift and never performs in the gym what he's capable of after a taper. So we deload his bench or his deadlift a decent amount because he needs it. So we have this times 0.85 for a 15% drop. And we have his deadlift, and we're going to take that through for each day. Copy and paste. Whoops, too far down. All right, so there, pretty simple. Now, the harder part is understanding how I reach this point of understanding the percentage we need to deload for Patrick, but I'm going to get to that after I finish showing this entire example of kind of how we decide how much they need to deload. But all we need to do is, like I said, we have each individual lift and the amount they need to deload. The last thing we're going to do is go through and adjust the accessory movement. So we have contralateral split squat. That is more of a positional exercise, so we don't need to deload that much. I'm going to go to 6 or 7 RPE, so just about a 1 RPE drop on those. Neutral grip pull-ups. There's 2 ways I might do this, because I could argue sometimes with neutral grip pull-ups, weighted pull-ups, those can be decently fatiguing. So sometimes I might do a 90% drop from previous week, or I may just do at 6 RPE, which is about a 6% drop. So we have 8 RPE to a 6 RPE. But for Patrick, I know that these are fairly fatiguing for him, so we do a 90% of last week's weight. And so I'm going to copy and paste that to both of those. So he's going to do 90% of what he did last week on those weighted pull-ups. Dumbbell bench press. More of a compound movement, like I mentioned. So we're going to do 90% of last week's weight for Patrick, and then we're going to get to here in a second. I'm going to show you what we're going to do this dumbbell bench press AMRAP, but I'm going to leave it there for now, because all we're doing right now is we've been adjusting intensity. We haven't gone through and adjusted sets and reps yet, so I'm just going to leave that there, but I'll come back to it. And then we have hyperextension, so a more compound hinge-based movement. Again, Patrick tends to fatigue fairly high when it comes to kind of hinge-based movements like deadlift or hyperextensions. So we're going to do 85% of last week's weight. Bulgarian split squats. Decently compounded and fatiguing lower body movement. So I'm going to copy and paste 85% of last week's weight. Seated cable row, not very fatiguing. We're going to go to 7 RPE, and we're going to copy and paste that pretty much all the way down. he actually has this BFR bicep curl of choice that was programmed at a 7 RP. It's really high reps, and that's just mainly just for blood flow. It's not even for a training effect. We just find for him that does a real good job just keeping forearm tightness at bay by just getting blood flow. So I'm not even going to change that form. We just have that the same each week. But for the seated cable row and single arm tempo row with protraction, just decreasing 1 RPE. And then lastly, we're going into the final day of the week. We've got weighted dips. I'm going to go 90% of last week's weight, as we've got a compounded pressing accessory here. Don't need to insert weight. We're going to carry that down. We have all fours banded whole, which is kind of an abdominal positional exercise. We're just going to drop that down to 7 RPE. And then we have BFR tricep extension of choice. We're going to drop down to 7 RPE. So that is how I am deloading Patrick in the intensity aspect. So now we need to go and adjust sets and reps. So let's take a look at how we do this. So as I mentioned on squat, I tend to usually drop 1 set and drop 1 rep from each exercise. So for Patrick, we're going to do 1 rep from each and then 1 set. And I took, usually if I'm going to do the set, I'm going to take that away from the higher intensity set, not the lower intensity set, just dependent on the lifter, but this is more typical. So I took away 1 rep each for each set and took away 1 set for the workout. For here, I'm actually going to do something a little bit different. I'm actually going to just take away 1 set here and not change the reps because it's such a low rep day and such a low volume day that for him, I don't take away reps here just because it's such a low stress day to begin with. And then the last squat day, again, we're taking 1 rep away from each and then 1 set away. Going into bench press. As I mentioned, I usually don't take any sets away. So we're just going to do a rep decrease, 1 rep from each. Here we've got 1 rep from each, but we're not going to change that single because obviously we can't decrease that single to 0 reps or else we're going to take it away. But I want to keep that single in. So he still has a decently relatively heavy single for stimulus purposes, but we're going to take away 1 rep from each one of those and keep the sets the same. And then the final day, again, 1 rep from each, leaving the single there. Lastly, we've got deadlifts. So on his main deadlift day, we're going to take away a rep from each and 1 set. So we've got a volume decrease there with sets and reps. We're going to leave the single as is. And then on his other day, it's a little different since it's singles. Instead of just taking 1 rep away, I'm actually going to take 2 reps away from 2 of the sets and 1 rep away from 1 of the sets, because that's going to increase the deload a little bit more. Because like as I mentioned on the template, there's sometimes I do 2 reps per set on deadlift, just dependent on the lifter. And I know for Patrick, he needs a decent deload, and this is the lighter day. I'd rather keep the stimulus here on the heavier day because the intensity is going to help to keep him from detraining. But on the lighter day, we'll do even a little bit more of a drop, and we'll go 2 reps down in since these are singles, and then leave that one at 3x1. So with that, we've taken care of all of the main movements. The last thing to do is go through all of the accessories. So like I said, for the majority of the accessories, we're just going to take away 1 set, but we're not going to change the reps. So we're going to take away 1 set of contralateral split squats, and we're going to take away 1 set of weighted neutral grip pull-ups. Moving into the next workout, we've got dumbbell bench press. Notice here he has an AMRAP. That for sure is something on a deload week I'm going to take out because that's an intensifier that's going to create a higher level of fatigue than these other sets. So I'm just going to take that out completely, and that's the set I'm taking away from the 4 sets. And then lastly, hyperextensions 1 set. Here, 1 set away from Bulgarian split squats, 1 set from rows, and 1 set from single arm rows, but keeping BFR bicep curls the same. And then lastly here, we got weighted dips going down to 2 sets, or 3 sets total, 2 there on the back offs, and then 1 set of banded curls and leaving bicep, or the BFR tricep the same. So that was more to kind of give you the idea of how I'm actually going to program that based off of the previous week with the general framework of how I set up deloads that I've gone through within this. All right, so we know why to deload, we know when to deload. I've showed you how I structure those, the basic general conception of it, and actually showed you the example of me deloading Patrick. Now, how do we individualize that? How do we take those ranges of different intensity deloads and sets and reps and all that kind of stuff and actually know how to deload you? And from that, what I would say is if you are trying to apply this to yourself, take all the middle ranges. That's probably, that's why I did the ranges. Probably in the middle of that is where I start most people when I first am coaching them. With that being said, when I have some background from a lifter, maybe they're more experienced, they've had a coach before, they're fairly knowledgeable in programming, they program for themselves, I might have more of a data set to go off of. So I'm definitely going to take their feedback into consideration on how they tell me kind of how they fatigue on squat, bench, and deadlift. A lot of times I'm going to ask them kind of how they peak for a meet and how much they need to taper each lift, because that plays a big role and actually is the next thing I'm going to be talking about, and how a deload can tell us how to taper. But getting enough feedback from them to kind of a general conceptualization of like how I need to deload them from the start. And for someone that is just going to try and take this concept and apply it to themselves, just start in the middle there. From that, what we're really going to need to know is after the deload, when they're coming back into week 1 of training, I'm going to have lifters, when I first start coaching them, give me a lot of feedback on how they're feeling on each lift, because I need to know if the deloaded correctly. And I'm going to get one of 3 things. 1, they're going to feel really good. Great, we deloaded the right amount. 2, they're lagging. And what I mean by lagging, they just kind of go in, they're like, yeah, I don't feel like I'm fatigued, but just the weight feels kind of heavy. Like I just don't feel as explosive. That tends to mean that they're slightly detrained, that they were deloaded a bit too much, and I'll make note of that. I think the one that very commonly that happens on is bench press, because like I said, I have a lot of people that we don't need to deload their bench press very much, especially higher arch benchers. And so if I take more of a middle ground with them, and I've just started coaching them, I'll see a lot of times they'll say, yeah, my bench is kind of lagging week 1. And it wasn't until like week 2 we see this a decent uptick in their strength, because they kind of are able to retrain. And so I'm going to make note of that, because I need to know that, okay, I probably deloaded them a bit too much. We're going to deload them a bit less next time. The other one, so I said they either feel good, they feel lagging, or they feel fatigued, which is that means we just didn't deload them enough. They're coming back like, yeah, weight feels fine. I feel strong, and it feels good, but I just still feel a little beat up. My back's still sore, my legs are still a little sore. And soreness doesn't necessarily mean fatigue, but that's a lot of times the way lifters will kind of express their sense of fatigue is through soreness per se. So that's kind of what I'm going to look at, is we're going to continually adjust based off of that until on a consistent basis, they're telling me on week 1 that they feel good, because it may take a couple deloads for me as a coach to figure out how to deload someone. We might make little adjustments based on their feedback. And we may come back the next time and say, okay, yeah, squat feels better this time. I don't feel like I'm lagging, but bench, still lagging a little bit. Okay, we need to deload you even a little bit less. So the next block, we're going to do a little bit more. And we just keep tinkering until we find this consistency that week 1 we see a very consistent type of recovered state, but not lagging in the sense of feeling like they're detrained. And then once we find that, for the most part, I find that stays pretty consistent. I don't have to change a deload over time. Once I kind of figure out how to deload someone and the extent to deload, barring that a block is very stressful for some reason, we're doing some type of block to increase stress past what we normally do, we can pretty much deload the same throughout. Lastly, and I kind of alluded to this, the extent someone needs to deload a lift tells me a lot of information about how they need to taper into a meet. Because as I mentioned, we're looking at, after this deload, how do they feel on week 1? And a deload is beyond a taper. A taper is to get back to peak performance. A deload is usually going a little under peak performance, so that we are a little maybe over recovered week 1 to then progress back up to peak again, let's say week 4. A taper is to try and get us to just barely deload off of that stimulus to get right back to where we were on week 4, where we were at a peak, and then be there on meet day. And so the extent they need to be deloaded and what I see coming back on week 1 tells me a lot how they need to taper into a meet. And that's each lift dependent. Let's say Patrick, for instance. Patrick, we barely deload his bench press, barely taper his bench press. As you saw, we don't need to deload it very much, so we don't really taper it very much into a meet because he tends to detrain very fast. Whereas on deadlift, we know we have to deload him a lot, and the same thing happens in the meet. I mean, we start the taper of his deadlift about 2 weeks out. We take his heaviest deadlift about 2 Saturdays away from the meet, so about 2 weeks out, and then the 2 weeks after leading into the meet, we start tapering his deadlift because he needs a decent amount. Where with Patrick, he's benching pretty heavy about 4 days out from his meet because he detrains very easy. So we can use these deloads not only as a training tool within the structure of our normal programming, as I've mentioned throughout, of the whys, the whens, and the hows. we can also use it to be able to understand probably how we're going to peak into a meet and the type of taper we need for each lift and the extent of that, based on seeing the detraining effect and the recovery effect we see during a deload week. So it can be a really great tool if we get multiple data sets of multiple deloads over time. When we start looking to how do we taper for a meet, that is a great resource to understanding of how we're going to be able to translate that into peak performance on meet day. So that is deloads. Per usual, long video to really give you all the information possible, as I don't like to skimp through and just give you the basics. I really want to give you the full understanding of why I do things and why you should do things in a certain manner if you want to implement it into with how you program and you train. So we've covered the why of deloads and how that's going to help with not only physiological effects, but also mental effects of training and being able to create longevity of productive training over a span of time and limiting burnout and hopefully limiting injury risk by managing workload a little bit better. I've told about when, of understanding of how to structure training blocks in the sense of being able to understanding a kind of time to peak and when you tend to perform best within a training block and need to deload after. And like I mentioned, if you want more information on that, I'll link in the description box below the programming part 1 and part 2 series of volume and intensity. And then lastly, I showed you how to deload. If you need to, go take a little screenshot of the little template I put out and be able to use that and kind of helping you to be able to program deloads of using that, like I said, to be able to kind of have an understanding of the general amount. And then when I talked about how much you need to deload based off of the individual characteristics, just continually each block, plug and play based on kind of how you're feeling and be able to start individualizing that deload for yourself to create the best deloading effects so you come back still feeling strong and refreshed and not lagging from that. And then lastly, how to use that to be able to understand how to taper. So really a deload can be a great training tool for longevity, to be able to know how to taper, to be able to create ability for people to still live their life. And so that's why I really like to be able to, I still have that in a structured process that we have planned deload weeks as well as being reactive when needed. So if you have any questions, always happy to help. Just leave a comment down below and I will answer. Make sure to subscribe if you're not. Give the video a like, share it to some friends so that we all can be able to be master programmers within powerlifting. And I will talk to you all later.